Hi, everyone, and thanks for being with me. I'm going to talk today about a subject which I have particularly been involved in over the last almost 20 years now, and that's issues around child abuse. I mean, I started the first political party of its kind in Australia, if not the world, in relation to child protection specifically and caring for kids and doing something about a system which seems to be removing more kids than are necessary, and particularly amongst Indigenous populations. So, a news item came across my desk yesterday from the ABC in relation to a class action that has been instigated by some people around Australia, and particularly, I think, in Queensland. Now, the reason why I'm doing this particular post is not because people are all that interested in child protection, because my experience over the last 10 years in particular, since I formed the Child Protection Party and since I've started advocating primarily for families, for parents, and for grandparents, and for other people who have had children removed from them, I have become aware that more and more people seem to be less and less interested in child protection unless it specifically happens to them. So, my expectation around people actually watching these videos or this particular video is probably not too enthusiastic because those of you that do subscribe to my channel or just happen to look at some of my videos will notice that most of my stuff is particularly political commentary and criticism of certain aspects of politics. But today I'm going to talk about something that I have been working on for decades, and that this is an area in which I probably know more about because of my involvement with families in this particular space than most people do. So I'm going to talk about this today because this issue around a class action is important. Now, I've been advocating for this for years, and it's been very difficult getting something off the ground. Now, I have nothing to do specifically with this particular class action, but what I am asking you to do is that if you have had children removed from you, if you have had encounters with the child protection system, and you believe that those actions have been unjust, as most parents do, then I suggest that you have a look at this particular article, which I'll put the link down below so that you'll be able to view this for yourself. And if you wish to contact me, you can contact me on the email address I've just put up on the screen, and we can have a conversation, or I can at least refer you to somebody who may be able to help you directly. But nevertheless, if you wish to be able to get involved in this class action, the paper has a list of, or the ABC has a list of appropriate people that you can contact. So I'm just going to show you this article, and we'll talk about it as we go through it. Now, it's a complaint filed against Child Protection Department, with class actions to follow across Australia. And I think this one is in Queensland specifically. And this is a case which is quite common. So there are many cases where kids are removed. Now, there are a lot of cases clearly where it is appropriate that children be removed. So this isn't a dig necessarily at Child Protection Department, even though I've got many issues around the way that social workers behave and conduct their work. But in this particular case, I'm just looking at these particular cases that have been highlighted in this article, which specifically talk about how it affected parents and grandparents in one of these cases, and what can be done about it in terms of a class action. So the important thing I think to note about a class action is that if you're going to have, if you believe a child should not have been removed from you, then it is important that you find ways to mitigate against that. Now, in terms of Indigenous people, they're 5 to 7 times more likely to have children removed than other children because there's systemic racism within most departments. And unfortunately, amongst my colleagues, social workers, that is rampant. And the terrible thing is that most of these people don't recognise their degree of racism. But believe me, when you work with families and you hear what people say to these families, you have a strong sense that racism underpins many of their decisions. And they particularly target Indigenous people because they believe that for whatever reason, Indigenous people should not have children in their care. It's a repulsive thought, but nevertheless, that is the type of thing that this sense of racism seems to be, well, I guess it seems to be dominant amongst the profession. So in this article, it says here, when Casey's 5-year-old daughter accidentally bumped her head at a birthday party in 2016, she took her to hospital as a precaution. And this is common. I have worked with many, many parents who have experienced this form of behaviour. So they do the right thing, they take their kids to a hospital or to a doctor, and then someone makes a report because they're concerned about how these accidents occurred. And many accidents have occurred because they're simply accidents. Their kids just doing things that they shouldn't be doing in some cases. They fall over, they hurt themselves. And then someone looks at this person and says, well, because you're Indigenous, clearly this is a child protection issue. On that basis alone, and then they call in the department with their own biases come in, and they remove the children accordingly. So within days, both her children were taken away. Being what some might call a helicopter mama, wanted to make sure that she had no concussion. She said social workers were called by hospital staff over concerns of domestic violence, and Casey's daughter was removed from her care that day. And I just want to make a comment about that, is that what happens is that there are often issues within those families. The reality is that if it's a white family, the domestic violence either may not be all that dominant, it may be a less passive form of coercion, it may not necessarily be physical. Yet it still happens, and yet it's still controlling behaviour and should not be happening, and it does in fact impact, obviously, the women and their children. But because you're Indigenous, it's seen that most situations are violent. Well, they're not, but that's the way it is read. That's the belief that a lot of these workers have, and therefore, because number one, you're Indigenous, number two, because there's violence, then your children need to be removed. As opposed to finding solutions to the problem, which is about social workers having the skill set required in order to be able to work with the family so the children are not removed. But unfortunately, most social workers do not have those skills. And because they're so risk averse, they choose to remove the children for fear that something may happen, and they knew about it, not realising for one moment that removing these children creates trauma and a whole lot of psychological damage to these kids by simply having them removed, not to mention the psychological harm it does to parents, particularly in Indigenous communities where they're very wary of the welfare state anyway, because of the history that they have and because of the intergenerational trauma that has been caused by, in some cases, many cases, in fact, their own parents being removed, and also, and often in many of these cases, they have been removed from their families. So it just increases this trauma, adds an extra layer to it, and when their own kids are removed, you can imagine the trauma that might cause them. None of that, though, is considered by the social workers or those people that work with these families. They do not care. They just remove kids because they're concerned about their own, how this is going to affect them, as opposed to how it's going to affect the children and the parent. So I felt like, she says, I was in hysterics. I felt like my whole life was pulled apart in moments and seconds. Casey's younger daughter, who was 8 months old and breastfeeding at the time, was taken from her arms days later and placed with other relatives, separated from her sister. When it first happened, I felt like the kids had died. And this is, in fact, this is a statement that many parents give, that this is not uncommon, that it's like your child has died. That's the kind of grief and extreme pain that you go through. A feeling and an emotion that social workers tend to ignore and that they should be mindful of, because when those emotions are in play, they can put some states, when deep emotions are in play, that's the time to be able to put in appropriate interventions. But they ignore all of that. Casey is one of hundreds of claimants to sign up to a landmark class action against 5 states' child protection departments. Complaints allege widespread racial discrimination. Well, no surprise in that. Class actions will be launched in South Australia, Victoria and Western Australia to the Human Rights Commission, with the first complaint filed in New South Wales on Wednesday. The complaints allege widespread racial discrimination against First Nations families whose children were removed from their care. The Queensland class action is being handled by Bottoms English lawyers and spearheaded by Brett Harold Gunning and Madison May Burns, who are suing the state over what's been labelled a modern stolen generation. And that's terminology I've used for a long, long time in relation to all of this, that what we're experiencing today is just another stolen generation. Yet people, and this is my frustration, folks, is that people don't seem to care about what's happening to these children. And they don't care on a number of levels. Number one, because they're Indigenous kids. Who cares about Indigenous people? According to the referendum, not enough. So this is a mounting issue that needs to be dealt with. And hopefully this lawsuit may change some of the attitudes in relation to this. The lawsuit dates back decades, with claims that Indigenous families were stripped of their cultural identity after children were removed and placed into the foster system with predominantly white families. Shine Lawyers Special Counsel Caitlin Wilson, who's leading the lawsuit, said the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child protection services is alarming. There's been 33 reports done in the last 26 years, and we've seen no change. And in fact, an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in out-of-home care, Ms. Wilson said. At the heart of it is racial discrimination, and they talk about the Racial Discrimination Act. Talking about Casey's situation is not isolated. The Queensland class action, which was launched in December last year, includes Cindy, who had 2 grandchildren removed from her care after she had followed the department's child safety protocols. I never thought what I did was wrong. I regret that night so much, she said. Under the Queensland Government's legislation regarding carer responsibilities, it is mandatory for carers to report a serious incident to the department. At the time, Cindy's grandson, who had been moved around to more than 50 homes, so the grandson was in care, moved around to 50 homes before finally being placed into Cindy's care, had been struggling with anger and PTSD, and understandably so. Cindy called police so she wouldn't lose her grandchildren, but she did anyway. So a lot of these people do what they believe is the right thing to do, and they wind up having their children removed regardless. So, and a lot of these kids, or these particular cases, are Indigenous, but there's lots of non-Indigenous families who have the same experience, perhaps not so much the sense of racism that you get with Indigenous people, but certainly prejudices, because most of these people, and in any of my broadcasts that I've done in relation to the Child Protection Party and the videos I've put out over the years, have been focusing on the fact that many people that are targeted are low socioeconomic individuals, and that when you look at the places in which child protection departments have got their offices, they're usually placed in those particular areas. So there's prejudice, there's racism, there's inappropriate social work practice, a whole host of things happen in this space. And the only way that we will ever make the government accountable and change their practice methods is for something like a class action to take place. So I would urge anybody who's watching this, who has an issue with the department, to contact any of these people, Shine Lawyers and the other people. I'd suggest you contact them as soon as you can to let them know about your case, because there is a case for non-Indigenous children to be incorporated perhaps in this as well, even though I understand this would be quite specific because it's about racial discrimination. But nevertheless, there are other people who are affected in the same way, not just Indigenous people. So let me know what you think. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. It's quite refreshing to put out a post which is not necessarily having a go at some political party. And please remember that you can contact me on this particular email address if you wish to have further information. Okay, thanks for being with me. A bit long-winded, but I hope you pass this on. If you know of somebody who has been affected by the child protection system, and unjustly so, which is a lot of people. My estimation has been around 60% of people could have their kids removed to them if those cases were handled appropriately. So contact whoever you can contact. If you can't get through to these people, then contact your local MP. But do something, become active. And also, you can contact the Child Protection Party, look them up on the internet, childprotectionparty.com.au, I think it is, and you could speak to somebody there. Take care, everybody. Look after yourselves. And more importantly, be safe.